Chapter 20, The Changing Life of the People. In this chapter, we'll be looking at marriage and family, particularly what changes occurred in marriage and family during the 18th century. We'll be looking at children and education, what was life like for children, and then how did attitudes toward children evolve. We'll be looking at food and medical practice. What were people's diets like, and how did medical care affect people's lives? And then finally, we'll look at religion and pop culture, particularly what the patterns of popular religion and culture were, and how those came into contact and conflict with the critical worldview of the educated people. So those are our main topics that we'll be looking at for Chapter 20. All right, marriage and family. This is going to be our first topic, particularly late marriages and nuclear families. So within the structure of the family, you have the basic unit of social organization. This is where human beings spend most of their time loving each other, reproducing children, imparting values to these children, and then repeating the cycle over and over and over. So when young 18th century European couples married, they normally established their households independently and lived separately from their parents. And then in the 17th and 18th centuries, the average person began to marry surprisingly late, and about 10 to 20% of men and women never even married at all. So couples did not marry until they could start their own household, and sometimes that meant waiting until the father died so that they could inherit land and then get married. In some places, laws and tradition dictated that couples had to get the legal permission or approval of their local landlord in order to marry. So that was also a stumbling block to people marrying earlier. And so the custom of late marriage combined with nuclear family households set European society apart from other areas of the world. And when a mature man and woman finally did join together in marriage, it provided some social and economic advantage and allowed for a little bit of equality even between husband and wife. So many young people worked either within their families until they could start their own households, and then some left home to work elsewhere. As far as the trades were concerned, a young man could enter an apprenticeship around the age of 16, and that meant he would finish up in his late teens or early 20s. And during that time, he was not allowed to marry. If he was lucky or he had connections, he might eventually be admitted into a guild and establish his economic independence. And from there, he would pretty much be set if he got into a guild. Obviously, many poor families couldn't afford an apprenticeship for their sons, and so those young men drifted from one hard, intensive labor job to another, always vulnerable to economic fluctuations and unemployment. The most common job by far for adolescent girls was service in another family's household. A lot of times the work was endless, and there were few laws to limit the exploitation of these female servants. In theory, domestic service or working in another family's household offered a young girl protection and security within this new family, but in practice, she was often easily preyed upon by the men of the household or their friends. And unfortunately, servant girls who ended up pregnant were a lot of times either thrown out in disgrace or turned to prostitution as a matter of survival. Okay, so premarital sex and community controls. Birth control in Europe before the 1800s was primitive and quite undependable. Condoms were made from sheep intestines. They were expensive, and they were usually only used by aristocrats who would engage in that type of behavior and prostitutes. But despite the combination of lots of sexual activity and the lack of reliable contraception, illegitimate babies were rare as far as church records were concerned. There was a study of parish records in the 17th century in England that showed that 20% of children were conceived before the couple was married, but only 2% were born out of wedlock. And these statistics really just reflect the power of community controls on the traditional village. The community's effort to police personal behavior and maintain some type of a moral standard was a significant part of village life. And violators, spouse abusers or adulterers, for instance, were often subject to degrading public rituals, such as humiliating donkey rides, or they had rotten vegetables splattered on their doorsteps, or there were insulting midnight serenades. So the community really worked to stop not premarital sex, but illegitimate children. So there was a new pattern of marriage and illegitimacy beginning around 1750. And the long-standing patterns of marriage and illegitimacy began to shift. For example, young people began to choose partners for themselves rather than following the economic or social interests of their families, meaning they picked people that they liked to marry. As more young people worked for their own money, their own wages, their economic autonomy translated into increased freedom of action. They had money, so they could do what they wanted to. So migration to the cities increased, and city life provided young people with more social contacts and less social control. So there was a rise in sexual activity among young people, which also caused the percentage of illegitimate births to skyrocket to as much as 36% of all births in some communities by 1850. So 36% in some places were illegitimate births. As in previous generations, many of the young couples who engaged in sexual activity intended to marry, but fewer men followed through on their promises once their fiancés became pregnant. And many of these men, like soldiers or day laborers or male servants, were no doubt sincere in their proposals, but because their economic situation was not secure, they were hesitant to take on the burden of a wife and a child. So these old patterns of marriage and family began to break down as young people pursued romantic aspirations and were also frustrated by low wages, inequality, and the changing economic and social conditions. Okay, so sex on the margins of society. This really boils down to two things, prostitution and homosexuality. Most prostitutes were working women who had to turn to the sex trade or felt like they had to when they were confronted with unemployment or seasonal shortages of work. And for them, imprisonment, banishment, and venereal diseases were a constant threat. But this provided an outlet for both single and married men for their sexual urges, and they were met with increasingly harsh laws in the 16th and early 17th centuries. Relations between individuals of the same sex attracted more condemnation than prostitution and were prohibited by law in most European states under the threat of death. So homosexuality was treated as a worse crime than prostitution. A lot of times, protected by their status, nobles and royals like King James I would engage in openly homosexual relationships, and they were accepted as long as they married and produced legitimate heirs. Same-sex relations existed among women as well, but generally that attracted less anxiety than those among men. So across the early modern period, traditional tolerance for sexual activities outside of heterosexual marriage began to fade, and attacks on immorality increased. Okay, childcare and nursing. The infant and child death rates during this time were really high, so a lot of times the joy of pregnancy was overshadowed by the fear of loss of either the mother or the child. Women of the lower classes tended to breastfeed their own children, sometimes for more than 2 years, which limited their fertility, the mother's fertility, but it also provided the infant with a really good immune system. A lot of times women of the aristocracy and the upper middle class would hire a live-in wet nurse to feed their babies for them. This would be another woman that was hired to breastfeed their babies. And women who worked in the cities relied on wet nurses as well because they needed to go off to work and couldn't sit home and feed their babies all day. Rural wet nursing was a widespread business in the 18th century, and in a lot of cases, children would actually live with the wet nurse until they were weaned. So maybe 1 or 2 years old, until they were 1 or 2, they would live with the wet nurse. Reliance on wet nurses contributed to high infant mortality, either because of the dangers of travel or the lack of supervision of the conditions in the wet nurses' homes, and the need just to share milk between the wet nurse's own baby and the baby that they had been hired to feed. So there was always a risk with wet nursing. Young women who could not provide for an unwanted child had few choices. Abortions were illegal and dangerous, so some hid their pregnancies, then delivered in secret, and then sadly smothered their newborn infants. If discovered, infanticide was punishable by death, but there were also foundling homes or orphanages, which first began in Italy but then began to spread throughout the rest of Europe. And as they were established and old ones were expanded, the number of foundlings being cared for surged. So by the end of the 18th century, European foundling hospitals were admitting around 100,000 abandoned children per year. So by the 1770s, a third of all babies born in Paris were being immediately abandoned to these foundling homes by their mothers. And a third of those came from married couples who were just too poor to feed another child. Sadly, even the best foundling homes, in the best foundling homes, 50% of the babies normally died within a year. And there were some places where that rate was closer to 90%. So great were these losses that some people even called the foundling hospitals legalized infanticide. So what were attitudes toward children like during this time? Some scholars have said that parents didn't want to risk forming emotional attachments to their children because of the high mortality rates, and that was undoubtedly true. But there's also evidence from letters and diaries and family portraits that seem to indicate that many parents did cherish their children and suffered greatly when they died. Around 1760, critics began to call for greater tenderness toward children and proposed interesting new teaching methods. And among those was actually Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and his work was called Emile, or On Education, where he lays out what he believes was the perfect education for children. And he fervently advocated breastfeeding and natural dress for all children, along with them getting lots of playtime and fresh air and exercise, especially for boys. And he believed that women should receive some education, but he also believed that women's nature destined them for a life of marriage and child rearing. And so he insisted that girls' education should be mostly focused around their future as a wife. Interestingly, Rousseau was kind of a hypocrite in terms of Enlightenment thinking because he abandoned all 5 of his children to foundling hospitals. The spread of elementary schools. Schools that were built for common children began to appear around 1650, and such schools specialized in teaching 6 to 12-year-olds basic literacy, religion, and some math for boys and needleworking for girls. In Scotland, they believed, or Presbyterians believed, that the path to salvation lay in careful study of the scriptures. So they established parish schools for rich and poor alike, for the purpose of salvation, pretty much. The Church of England did a similar thing by establishing charity schools for poor kids. And these were inspired by the Protestant idea that every believer should be able to read the Bible for themselves. Prussia had compulsory education for boys and girls, meaning they were required to attend. In the 1660s, France began setting up charity schools to teach children their Catholic catechism and prayers, as well as reading and writing. In 1774, Habsburg Maria Theresa issued her own compulsory education edict, and she required 5 hours of school, 5 days a week, for all children aged 6 to 12. And so across Europe, some elementary education was becoming a reality, and schools were growing in significance in the life of children.